All right, so let's jump into another deep dive today. We're going to be tackling a topic that I know a lot of you have been thinking about, and that's China and their stance on the war in Ukraine. Are they really neutral, or is there something more going on?
Well, it really is the million-dollar question, isn't it? And to get to the bottom of it, we're going to be looking at an analysis by Fernando Farfan, an expert on the Asia-Pacific region. It's from a special edition of GOD's magazine.
Perfect. It's a great article that looks at China's strategy from a few different angles:
hmm
economic, geopolitical, and military. So what exactly is China looking for in this conflict? And what does their stance mean for, global power?
Well, right off the bat, Farfan asks this really crucial question. Is China truly neutral, or are they actually forging some strategic alliances here? At first glance, it seems like they're trying to walk a tightrope.
Yeah, totally. Like, on one hand, they need global stability,
Yeah.
right, for their economic growth. And the war obviously throws a wrench into that. But at the same time, we're seeing how China is also kind of trying to use this situation to their advantage.
And this is where Puga's analysis from back in 2025 comes in. He was warning about the vulnerability of that modern Silk Road, that network of infrastructure connecting China to Europe. With the war impacting key trade routes, especially in Central Asia, well, Beijing's got to be worried.
Right? Because even though most of the modern Silk Road is maritime, remember, it still needs to go through the Black Sea to get to Europe, and that area has been hit hard by the conflict. So if this war were to spread, China's access to Europe would be in jeopardy. And that's a huge blow to their global ambitions.
Precisely. And despite this concern for stability, China hasn't condemned the Russian invasion. In fact, as Shudlik documented in his 2025 analysis, China's actually increased its imports of Russian hydrocarbons significantly. They've basically become an economic lifeline for Moscow.
It's interesting how China's playing this economic opportunism card here. They're getting energy resources at better prices, while at the same time, they're providing Russia with crucial semiconductors, including for their military.
And let's not forget about their technological collaboration in areas like drone production. I mean, China is not only reaping economic benefits, but they're also using this war as a testing ground for their own military tech.
So they're basically taking advantage of the situation to advance their military capabilities without getting directly involved.
Hmm.
Smart.
hmm.
But what about the geopolitical implications of all this? What's going on there?
Well, Konstantinovsky in his 2024 analysis reminded us that this war has only strengthened the alliance between China and Russia, two countries that, let's be honest, share a pretty critical view of the U.S. and NATO.
And don't forget those meetings between Putin and Xi Jinping. They've proposed a new global security order. It's a direct challenge to U.S. leadership.
Exactly. China and Russia are laying the groundwork for a multipolar world, one where their influence is at least equal to or even greater than that of the West. And this brings us to a fundamental question. Could this geopolitical realignment trigger a major shift in the global balance of power? I mean, think about it.
It's definitely something to think about. And to understand just how deep this alliance goes, we need to look at the increasing military collaboration between China and Russia. The CSIS, back in mid-2024, they were reporting over 100 joint military exercises. 100.
It is a staggering number, isn't it? This intense military cooperation demonstrates not only a shared military doctrine, but also the fact that they have a common rival, the United States. China and Russia are pouring huge resources into preparing for a potential conflict with West.
But there's one element in this equation that causes some tension for China: the involvement of North Korean military units in the war.
Ah, yes. This is where China's image as a peacemaker gets a little complicated. Even though they haven't directly intervened, their support for Russia and the participation of North Korea, a country heavily dependent on China, it does project a bit of an ambiguous image.
It's like this indirect armed intervention, like a veiled support that kind of contradicts the image China tries to project to the world.
Meanwhile, Chinese military analysts are carefully observing the West's response to the war in Ukraine.
What do you mean?
Well, as Taylor analyzed back in 2023, China's extracting lessons from this conflict. They're studying the Western response to anticipate potential scenarios if they were to, say, invade Taiwan or face conflict in the South China Sea.
So basically, the war in Ukraine becomes this learning ground for China, a stage where they can assess Western strategies and tactics.
Precisely. And that leads us to the next question. How will the outcome of the war in Ukraine influence China's future actions in their own sphere of influence? So going back to that question we left hanging, How might the outcome of this war influence China's actions in their own backyard? It's a really key point to understand what's driving Beijing.
Right, you're right. China's watching what's going on in Ukraine very closely, and not just from a military perspective, but economically and politically too.
Exactly. And this is where Farfan's analysis becomes even more important. He argues that for China, a total Russian victory, it isn't actually the ideal outcome.
Really? Why not? I mean, you'd think a strong Russia would be in China's interest, in their whole goal of challenging the West.
Yeah, well, in the short term, maybe. But in the long run, a Russia that's too powerful could become, well, unpredictable, even for China. Plus, a Russian victory that further destabilizes Europe would have pretty negative economic consequences for, well, everyone, including China.
I see, I see. So China's looking for a balance then, not some radical change that could end up hurting them. So what would be the most favorable scenario for Beijing?
Well, Farfan suggests that a Korean-style armistice could be the solution that China sees as most, well, most appealing.
Okay, for those who aren't, history buffs, could you explain what a Korean-style armistice would look like?
Sure. So the armistice that ended the Korean War back in 53, well, it wasn't a real peace treaty. It basically split the Korean peninsula in two with a demilitarized zone in between. And technically, both sides are still at war. But hostilities ceased, and a fragile but lasting peace, it was established.
Interesting. So are you saying that China might be aiming for something similar for Ukraine, like a kind of freezing of the conflict?
Exactly. An armistice would allow them to contain the spread of the war, limit the economic fallout, and at the same time, keep Russia in a state of constant tension with the West. From a Chinese perspective, it's a scenario that would let them keep playing both sides, maintaining support for Moscow without completely breaking with the West.
Pretty clever strategy, that's for sure. But going back to the initial question, how could this outcome in Ukraine influence China's actions in their own sphere of influence?
Well, China is very carefully observing how the West is responding to this whole war in Ukraine. They're analyzing the sanctions, the military strategies, how united NATO is. They're learning lessons that they could apply in a potential similar scenario with Taiwan, let's say.
So the war in Ukraine is kind of like a strategy manual for China.
In a way, yes. China can assess how effective Western weapons are, the resilience of Ukrainian forces, how quickly NATO can respond. All that information, it's valuable for Beijing as they try to consolidate their position in the Indo-Pacific.
And we can't forget about that growing military cooperation between China and Russia. Those 100 joint military exercises we talked about. That's a clear sign that both powers are getting ready for a possible confrontation with the West.
Precisely. China isn't just learning from the Ukrainian experience, they're also strengthening their partnership with Russia, creating this united front against what they see as Western hegemony.
It's a complex landscape, no doubt about it. But I think Farfan's analysis gives us some, really valuable insight into what motivates China and what their future actions might be.
Absolutely agree. His work helps us connect the dots, see beyond just the daily news and understand these long-term geopolitical dynamics that are at play. And in that sense, the war in Ukraine is a turning point. It's an event that's reshaping the global chessboard as we speak.
And China, as we've seen, is not just a bystander, but a key player in this whole reshaping. But there's still one more piece of the puzzle to analyze. How could the war in Ukraine impact the global economy, and what does that mean for China? We'll explore that in the final part of our deep dive. Okay, so let's pick back up on our deep dive with a question that I think is on everyone's mind. How is this war in Ukraine impacting the global economy? And specifically, what does it mean for China?
Yeah, it's a tough question, but Farfan's analysis gives us a few really interesting insights. First of all, we have to remember that China's a globalized economic power. They have strong trade ties with both Europe and the U.S.
Right, of course. That means any kind of disruption to the global economy, like we're seeing with this war, well, it directly impacts China.
Absolutely. This war has messed with global supply chains, right? It's driven up the prices of energy and raw materials, and it's just created a lot of uncertainty in financial markets. All of that negatively impacts China's economic growth.
But hold on. Isn't China actually benefiting economically from this war by, buying Russian oil at lower prices?
Yeah, in the short term, there might be some advantages, but in the long run, this global economic instability doesn't benefit anyone, really. Plus, if China aligns itself too closely with Russia and openly challenges the West, well, they risk facing economic sanctions, and those could be devastating for their economy.
It's a dangerous game, for sure.
Yeah.
On one hand, China wants to take advantage of the situation, get those economic benefits, but on the other hand, They can't risk losing access to those Western markets.
Exactly. And that's where you see China's strategic caution coming in. They're trying to maintain this balance, like a kind of pragmatic neutrality that allows them to navigate these turbulent waters without sinking.
But as we were saying earlier, this war in Ukraine also presents a unique learning opportunity for China, right? To kind of observe how the West is responding to a crisis of this scale.
It's like a real-time geopolitical laboratory. China's analyzing the economic sanctions, the effectiveness of Western weaponry, NATO's ability to respond quickly. All of this gives them valuable information for their own strategic planning, especially when it comes to Taiwan.
So the war in Ukraine, it doesn't just have economic implications for China, but also military and geopolitical ones.
That's right. And it's at this point where Farfan's analysis becomes crucial, to understand the complexities of what's happening today. He helps us connect the dots, understand the motivations behind China's actions, and maybe even anticipate some possible future scenarios.
Definitely a must-read for anyone interested in global geopolitics and the role that China is playing in this new world order that's taking shape.
And for those who want to dive deeper into this analysis, remember you can read Farfan's full article in Geodes magazine. Plus, you can subscribe to the magazine for free at geodes.com to get more exclusive content on the Asia-Pacific region and, well, other current events going on around the world.
So in the end, this war in Ukraine has presented us with this incredibly complex and constantly changing geopolitical landscape. And understanding the strategies of different players, like China, is key to navigating this new world.
And with that, we've reached the end of our deep dive into China's strategy in the face of this war in Ukraine. We hope this analysis has given you a clearer perspective on the conflict and its global implications. Thanks for joining us on this journey of discovery. We'll see you on our next deep dive, where we'll continue exploring the topics that matter most to you.